our control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in just one moment. Before we do get started, as always, I want to check in with you and make sure that everyone can hear me, that everyone can see the screen behind us, and the little multicolored post-it notes, that all of that is working perfectly so that we can deal with any tech issues on the front end. So if you would, in your chat box, if you can just let me know really quickly if you can see and hear so that we can take care of any of that before we get started. All right, it looks like we're good. I appreciate you all for letting me know. It looks like everything is great. I am going to go ahead and get started. I do want to let you all know that this webinar will be recorded today, and I will send out that recording this afternoon along with your certificate, and any resources and things so that you all can look forward to that probably around 1 or 2 after I can get everything uploaded. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I want to mention before we start digging into the topic, we're going to talk about today's service with male and with LGBTQ clients in sexual assault centers and sexual assault services. And before we get started, I want to give a couple of really brief notes about language and things like that are going to be used throughout this presentation. To start with, hopefully you all are familiar with the LGBTQ acronym. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer in questioning. I want to make a note about the term queer. Historically, it has been used in a derogatory way, and I want to point out that it is still something that is divisive within the LGBT community. That some people are reclaiming it as an umbrella term to describe anyone who is not straight, or describing people who are attracted to multiple genders. It is also a word that is used in academia, books and resources on things like queer media or queer studies. And so it's very important that we know that that term can be divisive, that term should really only be used by folks who, by and for folks who really self-identify in that way. Because while there is a lot of internal power in reclaiming terms, that power can only be accessed by those folks who are choosing to reclaim it. And we don't want to use terms for folks that have been, hurt or marginalized by those words. The other thing that I want to point out before we really dig in is that sexual orientation and gender identity are not the same thing. So we're talking about both today. And doing kind of a very broad overview. But it's important to note that when we're talking about folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, their sexual orientation is not necessarily, that's when we're talking about who folks are attracted to. But we are not talking necessarily about gender, right? Because there are, we're talking about male victims who are straight. We are talking about transgender victims who may be straight, they may be gay, they may be bisexual, but their gender and their sexual orientation are two separate issues, and we don't want to conflate the two, right? Because there are plenty of folks who are transgender or gender nonconforming or gender queer, who identify as straight, right? So the two are not interchangeable, and so we need to remember that as well. And oh, thank you for this wonderful comment. Someone commented that queer also represents a certain group of the gay community that doesn't fall into norms. So more artist types or non-professionals. Again, and this is self-identifying. So this term is used in a lot of ways that can be, like I said, really empowering for folks who choose to use it. But that's a very personal choice. So the last thing that I want to do before we move forward is I want to do a couple of polls. So I really want to get some feedback and some opinions from you all about the work that you're doing and what you're seeing within your agencies. So here's the first one. Is your organization regularly serving male and or LGBT clients? And I just want to know about the volume of folks that you're serving. And I'll give you just a minute or two to respond. All right, I'm waiting for everybody to respond. I'm going to give about 10 more seconds for anybody who hasn't responded yet, and then we'll look at the results. Okay. So here are the poll results. As you can see, about 20% of you said that yes, you're serving LGBT or male victims more than weekly, which is wonderful. But I'm also seeing that over 50% of you are saying that you're only serving these types of victims, these communities, a few times per year or less. So that's interesting to me, and we're going to talk about more about that moving forward. So I have one more poll that I want to do before we move on. And this is, I want to know, how confident do you feel in your use of language and terminology regarding LGBT folks? Okay. So, as you can see our results here, about 60% roughly are pretty confident or very confident About 40% of us are actively learning more, but would not describe themselves as comfortable. And that's okay. What I want to see is that you're actively reaching out, that you're actively seeking knowledge and education, that you're actively learning. Okay, so we are going to move forward to talking about some data and statistics that I really want you all to be aware of as we have this conversation today. So there is some resources, but here are the statistics. So as you can see, there are extremely high rates of sexual violence and intimate partner violence within the LGBTQ community. And I also want to mention, and I didn't type it on here, but I want you to know kind of some overall statistics regarding population. So according to Gallup polling and the Williams Institute, what they are reporting out is that about 4% of the population identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, somewhere in that that community in terms of sexual orientation. Now, it's important to note that when we're talking about polling and statistics regarding the LGBTQ community, we always want to be aware that polls tend to vastly underreport the numbers of folks in the community, because there is always fear of being outed, fear of information being shared or spread, that folks are not always honest or open within polls. And polls are only looking at, by and large, adult folks who identify, okay? So the Gallup poll reports about 4% of the overall population. We know that that's low. But even at 4% of the population, even if we take the 4% as accurate, that means that there are roughly 264,000 LGBT folks in the state of Tennessee alone. And those same polling reports that transgender folks make up about 1% of the population. Again, we think this is very low. And this is also not counting folks that are maybe non-binary or gender non-conforming, or that don't yet identify as transgender. But even if we take that 1% of the population at face value, that's still 66,000 folks in the state of Tennessee. Okay, so these are huge populations, huge communities that, as you can see based on the statistics of victimization, really need our help and really need our services. Looking at this, another thing that you can see is that within the LGBTQ community, transgender people and bisexual women face the most alarming rates of sexual violence. And among both of these populations, sexual violence begins early and often begins during childhood. And what we think from a research standpoint is that it's possible that negative stereotypes about bisexual and transgender people contribute to this increase in violence. We all know that our culture often portrays bisexual people as promiscuous or duplicitous. We've all seen the really horrible stories that have come out over the last several years regarding the transgender bathroom bills and portraying transgender folks as dangerous perpetrators, and all of that really contributes to violence against these groups of people. The other thing that we know is that bisexual folks in particular, when we're talking about sexual orientation, are less likely to come out about their sexuality than gay or lesbian folks. And so one of the unique power and control tactics directed toward the LGBT community in terms of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, is the threat of being outed. And again, if we know that folks who identify as bisexual are less likely to come out and less likely to be out, it may be a particularly powerful threat against folks who identify as bisexual, that, you know, if you tell anybody what's happened, or if you tell anybody what I've done to you, I'm going to out you. And the other thing is that for LGBT folks, their sexual identities and gender identities and the discrimination that they face surrounding those identities often make them hesitant to seek help from police, hospitals, shelters, rape crisis centers. I think I didn't point out this statistic specifically, but it's important to look at this statistic here that says 85% of victim advocates surveyed by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Providers reported having worked with an LGBT survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And we're going to talk more about that as we move forward, but I think that's important to keep in the back of your mind, because 85% is a huge, huge number. So we also know that the number of female perpetrators and male survivors are likely undercounted. Both people who've had a female perpetrator and those who identify as male or who identified as male at the time of their abuse may not classify what happened to them as sexual assault. People who experience either of these types of abuse dynamics are far less likely to report the crimes to authorities, to researchers, or even to loved ones. And part of that is because we have such an ingrained stereotype, right, that men can't be victims, women can't be perpetrators. We use terms like violence against women to describe these acts, and it's very alienating for folks whose victimization doesn't fit in this prescribed experience. And the other thing is that although we know that overall the vast majority of sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone known to the victim, in our culture, homophobia puts LGBT people at a greater risk for sexual assault by strangers as well. It's common for perpetrators to use sexual violence as a way to punish and humiliate someone for being LGBT, or for even appearing that they might be. A common example of this is what is called corrective rape. That's when individuals think that they can change a woman's sexual orientation by sexually assaulting them. And the primary targets of this kind of rape are lesbian and bisexual women. We also know that a huge portion of hate crimes perpetrated against LGBT folks are sexual in nature. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you have to, as a male victim, as an LGBT victim, you have to grapple with the myth that abuse is something that happens by men against women, and also that abuse is something that is done to us, because often, even codified into law, we think about rape as a male perpetrator penetrating a female victim. So the myth that sexual abuse is always something that happens to us leads to individuals who were forced to perform sexual acts not considering what they've gone through as rape or sexual abuse. It's only been in the past 3 years or so that the FBI's definition of rape changed to include male victims. So we know that even laws still can reflect this idea that males can't be raped by females, or people who have penises can't be raped by people who have vaginas. And we also need to really recognize feelings of isolation after a sexual assault, and we see those in almost every victim that we work with, right? In terms of rape and sexual violence. Survivors often feel isolated. They often feel alone, and this can be heightened for male survivors, for survivors who are in the LGBTQ community, because when in terms of straight male survivors, culture tells them that they can't be victims. Movies, TV shows, comedies tell them that they can't be victims of sexual violence. And in terms of LGBT survivors, many already feel isolated from mainstream culture. They may have unsupportive family members, unsupportive faith communities, and so that they know that there's not really anybody that they can reach out to if they are assaulted. That can increase the feeling of isolation. And I want to make a really important note, something that I think we don't discuss very often when we're talking about sexual violence in general, but something that I think is particularly important in terms of our LGBTQ victims. Many folks who don't intend to be having sex with people who have penises are not on birth control because they don't have to worry about a pregnancy risk. If they've determined that they have a low probability of becoming pregnant, they may discontinue birth control or lose track of menstrual cycles because, for a lot of reasons. For one thing, menstrual cycles can be very triggering, can be very isolating for folks who identify as male. And again, if you're not intending on having sex with somebody who can get you pregnant, you don't feel the need to necessarily take birth control for pregnancy reasons. This may increase the risk of pregnancy resulting from assault in these communities, particularly when we're talking about corrective rape, when we're talking about stranger rape. And these unintended pregnancies can cause added trauma. And so it's really important for our sexual assault providers to have an idea of what options exist, how to help victims explore their options, how to connect them with agencies in your community and in the state as a whole that can help them with the potential of unintended pregnancy in these cases. And another thing is, and this is another kind of social myth that folks in this community often grapple with, is this idea of, well, you're only gay or you're only a lesbian or you're only transgender because of the abuse that was done to you, right? And either invalidating their identity, compromising their identity, or isolating them further from the community by putting into question the validity of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So affirming that identity, pushing back against these myths is incredibly important. And it's also important to note when we're talking about moving away from terms like violence against women and thinking about embracing complex identities, that there are larger umbrella terms like violence against women, gender-based violence, that tells male victims, that tells transmasculine or gender non-binary survivors that they're unwelcome at services. You know, we have agencies that still have the specific word women in the name of the agency. And this can be very isolating for victims who don't identify as women, who are not women, because that tells them that what happened to them is less significant or less harmful, that they don't deserve or cannot access support or treatment. So we have to be very thoughtful of the terminology that we're using, how we're describing our services, how we're asking questions, the assumptions that we're making. All of that is really vital. And remembering too that trauma and terror and fear and violence in general break the bonds between people. And we've already kind of touched on the fact that many LGBT folks, and I think particularly if we're talking about folks who live in our rural communities in our state, they are very isolated already. And so adequately addressing violence requires paying attention to helping them rebuild or create personal links, community links, to help them find places that are safe, where they can have a voice, where they can connect with folks who have similar experiences that they do, that can validate their lived experience, that can validate their identities. Okay, so before we move on to service provision, does anybody have any questions about anything we've talked about so far? If you have a question, you can go ahead and type it out in your chat box. and we will address those really quickly. So I'm going to give a minute or two for any questions, and then we'll move on to some strategies. And let me also say this, even if you don't have a question, I would really like you to give me an answer to this. What do you think advocates and agencies can do to better serve male and LGBT survivors? So put your questions in the chat box and give me your answers to this in the chat box, because I want to know what you all think are some strategies or some areas of need to better serve male and LGBT survivors. So I'm going to give about 1 more minute to ask questions and to give me some answers. Okay, so we've gotten a few answers. We said more advocate presence at LGBTQ events and public gatherings, more outreach, become more educated on current terminology regarding the LGBT community. LGBTQ pride rallies can have a table for information. I think that's an excellent idea. Increased funding to serve these communities, including male and LGBT survivors' voices in development of services, policies, etc. More of an open mind about what sexual assault and/or domestic violence can look like to different people. All experiences are different but matter. Attend more LGBTQ events, more publicity about violence against male victims. I think more rural communities. The solution is being present in the community as a whole, standing up and saying that we will not discriminate, standing up and saying that no one deserves to be treated with violence, continued education of the LGBTQ community. Of the LGBTQ community can help advocates understand and better assist. LGBTQ specific outreach within our communities. Funding for offender service providers. Agencies should be prepared to serve all who seek them. All right, I'm going to give another 10 or 15 seconds in case anybody's getting their answers in last minute. But I think all of these are really excellent ideas. I'm seeing a big theme of increasing outreach, of increasing communication and education. And I think all of those are vital. I think thinking about how we do outreach for very specific communities, whether it's the LGBT community, whether it's an immigrant community that you serve, whether it is male victims, whether it is a certain age group like college students, thinking of outreach strategies for those specific communities, because outreach is never one size fits all. You're not going to hit every population in every community just by going to the health fair or whatever that may look like. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. But if anybody does have any more questions or comments, please feel free to put them in your chat box and we will talk about them. Okay, so a lot of your answers are stuff on my list. So let's talk about what all of these things look like. So, acknowledging the multiplicity of violence and recognizing its reach. So I think this is really vital. We've talked a lot about, over the past year or so, and I tend to talk about with shelter services and shelter folks that I train with, but acknowledging that we can't separate the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault completely because there's so much overlap there, right? We know that the majority of victims of sexual assault are assaulted by someone that they know. We know that sexual violence is a huge component of the types of violence used by domestic violence perpetrators. So it's impossible to completely tease apart and completely separate those two issues because they're often co-occurring. And many times, obviously not always, but many times, survivors are experiencing both. And so I think it's important to apply that same understanding of the multiplicity of violence to minority and underserved communities, because these folks are often experiencing different levels and different types of violence that our agencies are not necessarily equipped to handle or address, but recognizing that they impact and multiply trauma is vital to our services. Folks who are experiencing institutional violence, in many of our communities, there still exist agencies whose purpose is to quote unquote re-educate LGBT folks. And many of them are under the guise of mental health associations, and they're incredibly damaging. This so-called conversion therapy can be incredibly violent, incredibly emotionally and physically traumatizing, and it's still happening. Institutional violence. Many folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer are afraid to reach out to systems like law enforcement or even hospitals because they're afraid that they will be discriminated against, they won't be believed, they'll be blamed, they'll be belittled, or even hurt, or even killed. And so folks are experiencing transphobia, homophobia. They're being turned away by their families. They're being turned away by their faith communities. And they're experiencing this lack of support, often on a community level, on a societal level sometimes even, that impacts the isolation and trauma they feel. Transgender folks in particular are at a huge and astronomical risk of physical violence and murder because of their transgender identities. And transgender people of color in particular have one of the, if not the highest murder rate in the nation. And so those individuals are experiencing violence, and they also know of the violence that is being experienced by other folks within their communities who share similar sexual or gender identities. And so that fear compounds the trauma that they experience from sexual violence. So as providers, it's vital that we really recognize what these folks are going through on multiple levels and how that can really impact their trauma response, right? Many of you on this call have sat through and listened to me talk about trauma in the brain and our body's trauma responses. And these types of complex, multi-layered trauma can really exacerbate those responses. Remembering that we want to be very careful not to generalize or assume that we know something about the clients that call us. If we have a male victim who calls us, we don't want to assume that their perpetrator was also male. We don't want to assume that anyone's perpetrator was male. We don't want to assume what their gender identity is. We don't want to assume what their sexual orientation is. And we need to be thoughtful about this, not only in our day-to-day language, but on the forms that we use during our hotline calls, on our intake packets, all of those things. Thinking about gender-neutral language, thinking about how we, as an agency, can textualize and put into writing who is a victim and who is not a victim. And when we are tacking on automatically a gender to victims and perpetrators in our paperwork, that sends a very clear signal to the survivors that we work with. We want to take a really unbiased look around our agencies. We want to look at our websites, our social media, our posters, our forms that we have clients fill out, our brochures, and material that we send out into the community, our policies and procedures, the decoration we have, the things that we have on our bookshelves, and really think about, are these images of us? Because everything that we put out into our communities, whether it's our Facebook page, whether it's our website, whether it's the posters on our wall, our billboards, our brochures that we take out and hand out at health fairs, all of those things are building an image of our organization. And is the image we're building inclusive and open and safe, or is it not? Are we always using gendered pronouns and using she for victims and survivors and he for perpetrators? Are we putting rainbow stickers on our walls, but every image of couples that we show on our website or every article that we post on social media is about straight heterosexual couples? Are we practicing what we preach? Because a rainbow is not enough. We have to really think about how we are reaching out on these multiple levels and the image that we're creating. I would also challenge you to look at not only the gender of the stock photos that you're using on social media or on your website, but also the ethnicity. Are they all white people? And many of you have seen the really, really great organizational assessment tool that the Northwest Network puts out. I highly recommend it if doing this kind of quick assessment is something that you feel would be beneficial to your agency. They make it into a very easy handout that you can grab and go through and really think about different aspects of your physical agency that you may not always recognize. Okay, so this is another question that I really want you all to answer for me really quickly in the chat box. When we talk about equitable services or equal services within our organizations, what does that mean to you? And I'm going to give you about 1 minute to answer, and then we'll talk about it. All right, I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds, and then we'll talk about your answers. All right, we've got a lot of answers. I appreciate you all. A lot of really great answers. So we have people who said, services for all services available to everyone, providing the same level of services no matter who we are helping, treating all with the same level of care, treating all people the same with respect and dignity that they deserve, listening and understanding each individual's needs, providing the same services to everyone across the board. Equitable services are providing the same services and meeting needs of all individuals, or making appropriate accommodations if necessary, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, or ability. Every service available to one victim must be available to all other victims, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, age, etc. Equitable services means that everyone, no matter their orientation or identification, can receive the same services across the board. The details of who you love, what you and who you are, all factors that do not affect services. Equal services are services that are available for all, but that meet the needs individually. I love that answer. So I think that's an amazing answer, and I think all of these are amazing answers. Equitable services are services that are available to all, but meet individual needs. And I think that's a perfect way to put it. We want to make sure that if you provide any kind of service, say support group, for instance, you're providing support group to all survivors, regardless of their age, their ability, their gender orientation, or their gender, their sexual orientation, but that you are individualizing services based on the client's needs, because not every client is going to have the same experiences and the same needs and the same goals. So I think that's wonderful, and I truly appreciate all of your answers. Thank you. So, when we're talking about equitable services, it's important to be aware of barriers to service. And many of you, and I want to draw attention to this, we talked about some barriers, being afraid of being judged, being afraid of being outed, being worried about confidentiality, being worried that an agency may not serve you because of your gender, because of your sexual identity. And I wanted to point out the statistics here, which says in a 2010 study by sexual assault centers, prosecutors' offices, law enforcement agencies, and child victim services, 94% of respondents said that they were not serving LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Now I can hear some of you screaming at me through the screen and saying, yes, but the Violence Against Women reauthorization of 2013 added conditions that prohibit discrimination, so that's probably changed, and this is a 2010 study. That's true. So for those of you who don't know or are not aware, when the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in 2013, they added a lot of non-discrimination prohibitions, which includes prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender or sexual orientation. And so we are making strides toward serving all folks, toward equitable services. And it's important to know that any agency who receives any kind of state funding or federal funding for their victim services, whether it's FIPSA funding, VOCA funding, STOP funding, rural funding, OVW, you are required to provide equitable services. However, as recently as 2015, a study by the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs found that although barely more than a quarter of LGBTQ survivors were even seeking services in victim service agencies, over 44% were still denied access, with the most common reason being barriers related to gender identity. So that's a really important statistic. On one hand, it's showing that only a quarter of LGBT survivors are even seeking services for a variety of reasons that we've already talked about today, whether they feel like they can't access services, whether they feel like they're going to be denied, that they're going to be discriminated against, that they're afraid, whatever that reason, that they're not identifying as what happened to them as assault. There's a lot of reasons that they're not seeking services. But when you have only a quarter of folks seeking services, that's showing a huge, huge lack of outreach and provision and collaboration with that community that I think we really need to recognize and work on. And the other half of that is, of the quarter of LGBTQ survivors who are seeking services, over 44% of those were denied on the basis of barriers related to gender identity or sexual orientation, and that's in 2015, after the VAWA provisions have already gone into effect. So it's vital that we be thinking about that, looking at that, recognizing that barriers still exist and it's still a work in progress. Understand reluctance to engage in the criminal legal system. We've already talked a little bit about, fear of or historical and institutional violence directed against marginalized folks. And so that we know that sexual assault is already the most underreported crime, but this population, both straight male victims and LGBT victims, are even more reluctant to seek services from the criminal justice system because of either not recognizing what has been done to them as a crime or as abuse, not thinking that they can receive services, not thinking that they will be treated with respect, being afraid of experiencing violence, and even hospitals sometimes haven't been trained to provide sensitive and non-discriminatory care to trans folks, and may re-victimize trans folks after they've experienced sexual violence, or male or cis, that is non-transgender male folks, are often re-victimized because of their gender identity. And a couple of you mentioned this when I asked you about what we could do better, but centering the voices of survivors in our agencies and in our advocacy. Making sure that whether it's on our board, on advisory committees, in our staff, that we are hiring diverse folks who represent the communities that we serve, that we are centering survivors' experiences, their goals, their voices, because everyone has different experiences and needs. That we are continuing all the time to learn, and we are seeking out training like this webinar, like training from Northwest Network or from Forge, all these different amazing trainers that can give you more information about working with these specific populations. And we're not expecting survivors to teach us, right? And for example, one of the things that I hear a lot is transgender used incorrectly. Transgender is an adjective, not a noun. Do not call someone a transgender. That's not okay. Do not add an unnecessary ed to the term. So transgendered is not a word. It connotates a condition of some kind. Never use the term transvestite to describe a transgender person. Know that the shorthand trans is a shortened term of transgender. It's often used within the LGBT community. And always use a transgender person's chosen name and pronouns. So it's, this is a transgender person, not transgendered. Use their names, use their pronouns. And find out what terms a person uses to refer to themselves, and then reflect those terms back to them. The use of a client's terms tells them that you're listening closely and that you respect their right to self-define. What you really need to know about transgender people, or anyone that you're working with, isn't going to come from an identity term, but from really asking specific questions related to needs, concerns, experiences, just like you do with any other client. And particularly important is to think about reflecting the words that they use for their own bodies, right? Reflecting the words that they use for their own experiences, because everybody is going to have different words that they're comfortable with regarding what happened to them. Okay, so reflecting those labels back to them. Know your community. When you're seeking to refer someone, if you have to refer out for mental health counseling, for instance, if you're referring somebody to medical treatment, know who you're referring to. Is it a safe place? Is it a place that is going to be friendly and supportive of male victims, of transgender victims, of different sexual orientations and gender identities? You can't send every person to the same mental health counselor and not really know that mental health counselor's work and stance with LGBT folks, because you may be sending them to someone who is very discriminatory and to use their identity as a problem, right? You may be sending them to an agency that is not friendly, that is not open and welcoming, where they may experience prejudice and more trauma. And also think about creating connections and collaborations with organizations in your community that serve and work with these different types of communities, whether it's the LGBT community, whether it's trans folks specifically, whether it's immigrants, whatever that may look like. Seek out agencies that work with them specifically. And it doesn't even have to be agencies that work with them around issues of victimization. Community centers, identity support groups, folks who work with those communities or people in those communities at any level, because you want to be able to make, as we talked about earlier, connections, help them find folks that can support them beyond just their victimization, their sexual assault victimization, because they may need help for other types of trauma, and they may really be seeking connection to folks within your community that have similar experiences in terms of sexual orientation or gender identity. Male LGBT survivors of violence need the things that all survivors need. They need safety, compassion, they need to be believed, they may need housing, they may need counseling, they may need medical services. Because of the unique experiences of homophobia and transphobia, there are some considerations for LGBT survivors of violence, and we're all still learning. You know, I was so gratified to see when you all answered that poll that so many of you said, we're still learning, we're still seeking. And we know that many crimes against historically marginalized communities are underreported. So the biggest thing to take away from today is that we continue to advocate for equitable, holistic, respectful, and compassionate services for all survivors. So this is a giant list of resources. You do not have to write them down right now. I'm going to send you this list separately with your certificate and the recording of this webinar. So I will send you all of these links and resources. I do also want to draw your attention to the Coalition's YouTube page. You can find it on YouTube by just simply searching TN Coalition, and we have a whole series of webinar recordings on that YouTube page regarding services of underserved populations, where we dig in deeper into best practices in serving those communities. So I highly recommend those if you want more training. Another great organization is Forge Forward. They do a lot of webinars and webinar recordings specifically on serving transgender community. And the Northwest Network, which does a lot of work on serving folks with different sexual orientations who are also victims of sexual or domestic violence. So are there any questions before we wrap up? I'm going to give you a minute or two to type any questions you may have in your chat box, and I'll stick around to answer. If you don't have any questions, thank you so much for attending. I will get your certificate and resources out to you shortly. And I hope you have a wonderful day. But if you do have any questions, stick around, type them in your chat box, and I'm more than happy to answer those or discuss them with you. All right, Melita, I am going to shoot you an email about that training and connect you with the trainer who can give you the information on that.